Hello and welcome back. This is the week 4 lecture. So today we start on chapter 4, and I would like to divide this chapter into two parts. So if you took a look at the course schedule recently, you'll know that we are spending 2 weeks on this chapter. There are a lot of different materialisms, so I want to spend 2 weeks covering them all. So here in week 4, we will just do part 1. That will consist of Marxism and cultural materialism. And then next week in the week 5 lecture, I will cover the new historicism, eco-criticism, and at least briefly, literary Darwinism. So hopefully that makes sense. And the chapter isn't terribly long, so I'm not breaking it up because of its length. I'm just breaking it up because these are pretty complex critical approaches. There are a lot of moving parts. They are notoriously slippery in many ways. So I just thought to do them justice and to avoid getting overwhelmed, it would be best to spend 2 weeks on the chapter. But because the chapter isn't terribly long, if you want to go ahead and read the whole thing this week, that's fine. And then you can sort of take it easier next week as we finish up. So I want to start today with Marxism, and then we'll get into cultural materialism. They are very closely related, and they go well together. So we certainly don't need to become experts on Karl Marx, Marxism, or socialism. And I know that many of us instinctively sort of shy away from these concepts, from these terms, largely because we associate them with former or maybe even current enemies of the U.S. We might hear these words and think of the Soviet Union or China or Vietnam or Cuba. And that's fine, and I'm certainly not trying to convert anyone. You guys don't have to buy a lot of these tenets, a lot of these concepts, but we must grapple with Marxism in order to get through this class because it has a big impact on the development of literary criticism, which might come as a surprise to some of us, but hopefully this week between the chapter and this lecture, we'll see ways that critics and scholars have applied some of these Marxist ideas to works of literature. So again, Marxism plays an important role in the development of literary criticism as a discipline, as a sort of coherent set of approaches. And Marxism is one of those approaches, but it also influences a lot of thinkers and writers who might not necessarily always identify as Marxists, but these ideas kind of filter down and they have a pretty wide-reaching influence. So let's just start with some basics, okay? So the book covers a lot of his key terms, concepts, and ideas. I don't want to go over all of that. I am not going to try to be comprehensive here today. I'm just going to focus on the most important aspects, as I typically do in these lectures. I just want to go over the things that are most important for us in this class, because the book can be a bit much at times. So let's just start with this notion of materialism. Before we go any further, the book does not really define this term, but they do tell us that Marx himself was a materialist, and he believed in this kind of materialistic construction of reality. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, we know the word materialism or materialistic. We're familiar with these terms. We use them in modern society, but they often have a sort of negative usage. They are often employed as insults. So if you call somebody else materialistic, that's often viewed as a synonym for shallow. You're basically telling them that they value material objects, things, more than they value, love, friendship, raising their children, or whatever. So typically it's bad in our culture to be overly materialistic. We're supposed to like things, but only so much. They're not supposed to be the most important part of our lives. But that's not really how we're using the term right now. So right now we're talking about a philosophical concept that Marx was subscribing to, and that many people still do. The philosophical concept simply states that matter is the fundamental substance found in all nature. And all things that make up our reality, all things, including mental states and consciousness, are direct results of matter, of material things, objects like buildings, beds, food, other physical bodies, and other material interactions. So we don't need to get too deep into the philosophy. This is not a philosophy class or a political science class, so I don't want to get too deep into the Marxism either. But I just want you to kind of understand that materialism starts out as a sort of philosophical orientation. It's a type of a monist philosophy, if you guys have ever heard that concept. Monist philosophies basically hold that there's just one substance in the universe. Well, there's just one substance making up our reality, and that for the materialist would be matter. And there's a related school of thought called physicalism, which is very similar. It just says that all the world is made up of physical things. So these are monist philosophies. They believe there's just one substance. Now that's held in distinction to dualism, which holds that there are two substances, and this is often characterized as mind and body, or maybe physical versus spiritual, or in some cases the physical versus the soul. Sometimes there are distinctions drawn there. And then we also have plural. I've already said dualism. We also have pluralism, which means that there are multiple different substances at work. So we don't need to know any more about that, but just know that materialism has this much older sort of history and origin. It's not like Marx just came up with it. He was a subscriber to this particular philosophy. And he believed that the driving material force of sort of modern human society was economics. So Marx is a German thinker and writer working in like the middle of the 19th century. So just remember a little bit about his sort of historical context. Rapid industrialization is going on throughout this century in both Europe and, of course, the US. Societies are changing very rapidly. And we have all these factories springing up. We have immense wealth being made, but we also have a large class of kind of low-paid workers. So what Marx is really interested in is the economic forces that drive what he would consider modern society. To us, it's old, but for him, modern society was the middle of the 19th century in the midst of this rapid industrialization. So he's interested in this class conflict. And you guys probably know this. You've probably learned a little bit about Marxism in the past. So he's interested in this conflict between the bourgeoisie, which is like the ruling class. You can think of them as the owners. They own the means of production. These are the factory owners. These are the store owners. These might be the entrepreneurs, the people that have done well. They own things. They own businesses. They usually own their own homes. They are often affluent, well-educated, and Marx would call them the ruling class. And then we have the proletariat, which is like the working class. These are the workers. They don't own the factories, they go to work at the factories. And even if we're not buying a lot of what Marx is selling, we can clearly see this distinction. I mean, he's not the only one, obviously, to point to the sort of clear difference between the owners and the workers. And this is pretty visible in virtually every society, but certainly in industrialized, sort of modern Western societies, we can still see this division. I mean, the owners have more money, they generally have more status, and they generally have more power. I mean, I think most of us would still agree with that today. So those are kind of the main currents of thought that he was pursuing that we need to be interested in. I mean, of course, there's a lot of other stuff going on, but let's let's kind of narrow our focus. And of course, he famously and wrongly predicted that eventually we would have a sort of class war and the proletariat would rise up and sort of throw off their shackles and they would defeat the bourgeoisie and I guess take all their stuff. That clearly has not happened, so that has led a lot of people to sort of ridicule Marx for being wrong about that. I would just say, in general, like most thinkers and great writers and philosophers, Marx was right about some things and he was wrong about other things. So his predictions proved wrong, but the reason he matters for us is because a lot of his concepts, a lot of the certain parts of his theory, they really do apply well to culture, particularly literature. So he thought that these different classes, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, they obviously had different interests. They wanted different things. And the ruling classes needed to keep the working classes kind of docile and pacified, kind of keep them entertained, keep them happy, so they wouldn't get angry at their inferior position. So what Marx saw happening was that the ruling classes had to sort of enforce this ideology or worldview. And they had to sort of get the proletariat to accept their worldview, their ideology, so the proletariat would cooperate with them. So the proletariat would keep on coming to work for low wages. So the proletariat wouldn't complain when they got sick or they got hurt. So the proletariat wouldn't stand up one day and say, wait a minute, why don't I make more money? Why do you guys have so much money? So there's this idea that the ruling classes used ideology to kind of keep the proletariat in line. And there were a lot of different ways that they could communicate or sort of, deliver that ideology. And one of those ways happened to be culture, art. Marx wasn't always super interested in exploring culture and art, although he does sometimes. But he does mention that this is one of the many commodities that will be produced in a modern industrial society. So he's interested in commodities and he's interested in this difference between what he calls use value and what he calls exchange value. And again, I'm no economist, so I don't want to get into this very much, but we can just kind of use what the book gives us, and I'll try to explain it a little bit more. So use value is defined as just the actual value or purpose of a product or an object that, gets made. So, okay, that's largely based on what the product actually does. Like what purpose does it serve? If it serves a very important purpose, if it is an essential product that people absolutely need and must have, well, then the use value is going to be pretty high. But a lot of times the factors that would determine the use value would be how hard it was to make the thing and how valuable that thing was going to be for whoever bought it. So if it was super easy to make and it wasn't super valuable, it was just kind of a luxury item, then it might not really have a high use value because the purpose it serves isn't terribly important and it wasn't very labor intensive or difficult to make. So that use value might not be very high for sort of a frivolous product. But if it's something really important that was difficult to make or it took a skilled laborer to make it, then it might have a higher use value. But again, use is really tied to the product itself. How is it made and what does it do? So that makes sense. That's pretty concrete. But then we have the exchange value, which refers to the market value, really. And I'm not going to talk about markets. I don't know much about markets, but I think we can just sort of assume that a lot of the market value is driven just by how much people want something or certain prestige or status that might get attached to certain products. So the important thing about the exchange value is it's not strictly based on the use. It's not strictly based on the product itself. There's a different value that's being assigned to it. It might not be based on usefulness. It might be based on something else. So Marx also talks about what he calls the commodity fetish. And that's when an exchange value really takes on like a life of its own and it kind of gets out of whack. It gets way beyond that initial use value, and it's not even connected to the use value anymore. It becomes important that exchange value is high because of other factors. Again, maybe social prestige, maybe power, maybe because it symbolizes something about yourself that's important to signal to people, but it's not based on usefulness. It's not based on what the product can actually do for you. It's about something more. And to Marx, this is troubling. But why this matters to us is because, for him, art and literature and other cultural productions, those would be commodities. He would consider those to be other examples of commodities that can be bought and sold. And they have a use value, right? They provide entertainment. They can be very pleasing or soothing. But then they also have exchange value. And they might even become fetishes. They might become fetishized or sort of adored and elevated to this level that's not based on their usefulness, but again, it's based on these other things that might not really have much to do with the product itself. So some of the examples they offer in the book are things like status clothing. I'm not sure I know exactly what that means. I think they're just referring to like expensive, like designer clothing. They mention cars, and they also mention homes. So they don't really elaborate very much at that particular moment, but I would just think that I think what they're getting at here is we still have this phenomenon today. We have certain things that are certain commodities in our culture, in our society, that they do have usefulness, but they have a market value that's really inflated, and it's really well beyond any of that actual use value. So think about a car. Think about a really expensive sports car. Yeah, it's a beautiful machine. It's very well made. It goes very fast. It looks great. But even with all those things being said, you have to acknowledge that the exchange value of that car is way beyond the use value. Because the use value, it's there, but it's not, a lot of cars can get you around. The basic function of a car is to get you from point A to point B. So a lot of beaters, a lot of old cars can do that for you. So the use value of any car or any house or any book, any work of literature is relatively low. Or think about a work of art like a famous painting. The actual usefulness of a work of art is pretty considerable. Yeah, it can make you feel good. It can help create the atmosphere that you want when you hang it in your home. It can soothe you. It can spark creativity. But there is somewhat limited use value. Pretty much any painting could conceivably do all of those things. But people spend millions of dollars for famous paintings because they have such a high exchange value. Because they have been fetishized. They have become commodity fetishes. They are valuable not because of their usefulness, but because they're status symbols. Because they signal that you're rich, or you're cultured, or you're a connoisseur. So I think that's the point that Marx is getting at with this idea of the commodity fetish. And art and literature can kind of fall into this. But again, we can see it perhaps more easily with cars and like a big mansion. Again, a mansion on some level serves that same usefulness function that a more modest house would serve. But, you get the bigger house because you have the money and it says certain things about you. So the exchange value is high, even if the use value is still relatively low. So for Marx, when these things are getting all out of whack, a lot of other problems ensue. But again, the reason Marxism is important for us is, again, he saw art and literature as commodities. And just like any other commodity, they could be used by the ruling class, by the dominant class, the owners. They could be used to sort of enforce that dominant class's ideology, to kind of, enforce it on everybody else. So later Marxist critics essentially saw things in a very similar way. And in fact, some even tried to answer the question, why did the proletariat never rise up and fight back against the bourgeoisie like Marx predicted? Well, later critics said, well, part of the answer is culture, because the ruling classes utilize culture so effectively they keep the proletariat down without the proletariat even realizing it. And think about this. I mean, people still talk about this today. This is not an old-fashioned idea that's fallen out of favor. Not everybody agrees, but it's still a topic of conversation. So there's this idea that if you want to keep people sort of ignorant of their economic or political realities, just entertain them, right? Just give them popular entertainment. Give them action movies. Give them popular fiction. Give them things to go and buy. Give them advertising so they can be good consumers, right? If you do all of those things, you distract people. Social media might play into this in our modern world. You distract people, you divert them, you get their attention focused on other things, so they're not really thinking too much about how much they get paid and whether or not it's actually a living wage, and whether or not the system is fair for all people. So again, this is still kind of a thing that people talk about, and Marxist critics would say the ruling classes were able to use culture so effectively that the proletariat never got around to rising up because they were distracted, they were entertained, they were busy buying stuff, not the nicest stuff, not the most expensive cars or the biggest houses, but they could go and get smaller cars, cheaper houses. They couldn't buy the expensive works of art, but they could get cheaper ones. They could get paperbacks. They could go and watch movies. So because even culture, like everything else, is dominated by the ruling class, the proletariat is almost getting brainwashed by it and pacified by it. That's sort of the idea here. But one thing we need to remember, again, you don't have to buy this stuff. I'm not trying to convert you. You certainly don't have to be a believer. But you do need to know, just from a historical standpoint, that Marxism and a lot of his ideas were quite popular in America between the end of the 19th century and like the 1930s or so. World War II really put an end to Marxism's popularity in the States, and I think we know why. At the end of World War II, even though we had fought alongside the Russians, we weren't exactly friends. Like, they were communists, they were getting a little bit more and more sort of extreme in certain ways, and we were opposed to them in almost every way except fighting the Nazis. We did that together, but as soon as the war was over, everybody could tell that the US and the Soviets were at odds. And that was the beginning of the Cold War. Not a real war. We never actually came to blows, but we had like proxy wars and we aimed missiles at each other. You guys know that. You know the history of the Cold War throughout the 60s, the 50s, 60s, up until the Berlin Wall fell, and in '89 the Soviet Union fell a couple years later. You guys probably know most of that. So again, we don't always want to go back and remember that Marxism wasn't always viewed as like enemy number one. It was really the Soviet Union that positioned Marxism in that way in the American consciousness. Prior to the Soviet Union sort of becoming our chief foe, prior to World War II, Marx, I wouldn't say, it wasn't the most popular political or economic persuasion, but plenty of people liked certain parts of it, and, it appealed to different kinds of people. So on one hand, you had a lot of sort of affluent liberal intellectuals. It appealed to a lot of them, as we'll see in a moment, but it also appealed to certain elements of the working class. The proletariat that Marx was describing. So again, World War II kind of changes all of that, but you do need to remember that in the early 20th century, there were Marxists in America. It wasn't totally uncommon. But once we jump forward to kind of the post-war order, or even just to the 1940s during the war, we have the development of these different sort of left-leaning critical approaches that owe a lot to Marxism, but they're not exactly Marxism. So they mention an example, many examples, but the first in the book that they get to is sort of this group of New York intellectuals. They are sometimes referred to as the New York intellectuals, led by this critic and professor named Lionel Trilling. Here's a collection of Trilling's essays. He's still read and he's still pretty famous today. If you pursue graduate study in English, you will probably have to read him at some point. So these guys weren't really hardcore Marxists. They were left-leaning intellectuals They were not looking for revolution necessarily, but they did support left-wing politics. They supported sort of more equality for the classes. They supported more, they wanted to kind of support or empower the working classes. And they tried to apply a lot of Marx's ideas to literature. But they didn't want to sort of resort to the Soviet-style communism that was already in place, that we already clearly opposed. So they weren't with Stalin, like they didn't support, the Eastern Bloc and all of that stuff. But they did think that some of Marx's ideas would be really useful in literary study, because what they wanted to do was to try to show how a lot of great literary texts reveal really important truths about money, class, and sort of the construction of modern society. And they were kind of coming at that from a left-leaning but not completely Marxist sort of political standpoint. So they just felt like in modern American life, money and class were really important, and sort of social structures were really important. So they just kind of wanted to explore that stuff in the works that they were studying, and they felt like Marxism gave them some tools to be able to do that. So other critics who kind of came along a little bit later in the 20th century were doing very similar things. So in the book, they mentioned George Lukács, Antonio Gramsci, the Frankfurt School. They were all doing different things. They all had slightly different, obviously, goals, and they had different approaches and different ideas, but they were all kind of unified in this general way, in that they were applying Marxist concepts to literature, art, and other aspects of culture. And like we were saying, a lot of them were kind of getting pessimistic and thinking that, literature and other forms of art had just become other commodities that were, again, being used by the ruling class to kind of oppress everybody else. But there were several important contributions that I just kind of want to go through quickly. So Antonio Gramsci is kind of an interesting guy, an Italian Marxist critic who was imprisoned by Mussolini for a long time. But he did something that we still kind of stick with today. He helped to draw this distinction between what he called the state, which is basically the government of a country, the military, politics, versus what he called civil society, which he pretty much considered to be culture, cultural production. And Gramsci thought that the dominant class really achieved its ends more through civil society than through the state. Now, of course, in some cases, the military might have to step in, or the government might have to throw somebody in jail or whatever, but he came up with this concept of hegemony, which is basically the idea that the ruling class has to maintain its power, its sway over everyone else. And to maintain that hegemony, just another word for kind of the power of the ruling class, in order to do that and to kind of make everybody else fall in line under it, that's part of hegemony too. In order to do that, again, they're using culture to help them do that. They're using civil society because that's more effective than the sort of overt violence of the state. You can't always bust heads. Sometimes you want to use culture to sort of indoctrinate people, to communicate the ideology of the ruling classes to the TV viewers or the readers or the people in the movie theater or the people consuming mass media or whatever. So we still kind of work with that basic distinction that he helped us to see. And then there's another critic, a French Marxist named Louis Althusser. I won't spend a lot of time on him, but he does a similar move. He makes a similar move to Gramsci's by sort of making this distinction between what he calls the RSAs, those are the repressive state apparatuses, like the military and the courts, versus the ISAs. Those are the ideological state apparatuses. So examples of that for him would have been the media, mass media, cultural and artistic productions, schools, and churches. And just like Gramsci, he says, yeah, it's the ISAs, it's the less violent, the less state control, at least less obviously state controlled institutions like culture, like the media, like school, and church. That's where the ruling class really wants to enforce the ideology. That's where the ideology really gets communicated. And we can see why. I mean, there is a logic to this. Again, you don't always want to be violent to the people that you're trying to keep in line, because eventually they will probably revolt if you keep killing them and beating them. But if you can indoctrinate them in school, in church, when they're listening to the radio, when they're reading a paperback novel, then they're not going to notice that you're indoctrinating them. They're not going to notice that you're exploiting them, that you're making them, the working classes, support you, the ruling classes, even though their interests are different than the interests of the ruling classes. But they're not going to notice, as long as you keep them entertained, and as long as you sort of get the message across when they don't suspect it, when they're in church, when they're children in school, when they're being entertained and relaxing and enjoying art and culture. So some of this stuff really does make sense even today. But yeah, it can be hard to get through it when they're just giving you name after name, idea after idea. But the story of the Marxist approach in literature basically follows along these same lines. Future scholars and critics would continue to do this kind of work that I've been describing. They're adopting certain Marxist ideas and concepts, and then they are sort of applying them to works of literature in order to accomplish certain things, but largely they're trying to empower the proletariat or the marginalized peoples, the oppressed peoples, the peoples who don't have the money, that don't have the power, and they're trying to find ways to either explain how culture is a weapon of the ruling classes, or they're trying to find ways that culture can be a weapon of the non-ruling classes. And that's what I want to pick up with in the next segment. So this is all part one. I don't want to be confusing, but my videos can no longer go beyond a half an hour because I have to clear off a lot of space on my computer, which is an ongoing process. So this is just part one of part one, and part two of part one is coming up next.